The millionaire forgotten by his family creates a fake, perfect girl to test his friends and relatives, but the woman hired for the role falls in love for real. The brown envelope on the mahogany table contained the results that Mason Bennett had been dreading. At 42, the diagnosis of a brain aneurysm wasn't just a sentence, it was a wake-up call. Dr. Richard's words still echoed in his mind, 6 months to a year with proper treatment. Mason spun around in his leather chair, gazing through the 20th floor windows at the silhouette of Seattle against the horizon. Empire Capital Group, the company he had built from scratch, was now worth billions, but what good was all that empire if in the last 15 years he could barely remember the last time someone had come to him without asking for something in return? Mr. Bennett. The voice of Patricia, his assistant for 2 decades, interrupted his thoughts. Your sister Amanda called again. She said she urgently needs to discuss financing for her new veterinary clinic. A bitter smile formed on his lips. Amanda? The same sister who hadn't shown up for any of the last 5 Christmases, but never forgot to ask for money. Her phone vibrated, a message from her nephew Brandon asking for help paying for medical school. The same nephew who only called him Uncle Mason when he needed something. It was then that an idea began to form in his mind. Maybe it was the recent diagnosis, maybe it was the weariness of years of golden loneliness, but for the first time in a long time, Mason felt a spark of something different. Purpose? Patricia, he called, pressing the intercom. I need you to get in touch with Stella Martinez from the talent agency. Immediately. 3 days later, Mason was looking closely at the portfolios spread out on his desk. Stella had selected the best actresses on the West Coast, all with experience in theater and improvisation. The plan was audacious, bordering on absurd, but he needed to know. He needed to find out who really cared about Mason Bennett, the man, not his bank account. This one, he pointed to a photo. Rebecca Anderson. 32 years old, graduated in performing arts from UCLA, specializing in contemporary theater. Excellent choice, commented Stella, adjusting her red-framed glasses. Rebecca has a natural talent for complex characters. But I must warn you, Mr. Bennett, what you're proposing is risky. Life is a risk, Stella, Mason replied, his eyes fixed on the photograph of the brown-haired woman with the piercing green eyes. And I'm running out of time to waste it. The plan was simple in theory, complex in execution. Rebecca would be introduced as Claire Matthews, a young tech entrepreneur Mason had met at a conference in San Francisco. The relationship would develop gradually, with Claire being introduced to Mason's social circle over the next few months. How much? Asked Mason, twirling his Mont Blanc pen between his fingers. Considering the complexity and length of the role, $200,000, plus expenses. Mason didn't blink as he signed the check. For someone who had built an empire worth billions, that amount was insignificant compared to what he might discover. A week later, in a discreet cafe in Pike Place Market, Mason met Rebecca in person for the first time. She was wearing a navy blue blazer over a white blouse, her brown hair tied up in an elegant but unpretentious bun. Mr. Bennett, she held out her hand with a professional smile. Or should I start practicing calling you Mason? There was something in her voice, a mixture of confidence and vulnerability, that caught him off guard. It wasn't the Claire Matthews character speaking, it was Rebecca Anderson, the actress who had accepted the most challenging role of her career. Before we start, Mason leaned forward, his coffee cup forgotten. I need to know why you took this job. And I want the truth, not a rehearsed answer. Rebecca held his gaze for a few seconds before answering. Because I also know what it's like to be invisible in a crowd of people who say they love you. It was at that moment that Mason realized he had chosen more than a competent actress, he had found someone who could truly understand the motive behind his elaborate farce. The contract is in front of you, he slid a folder across the table. But I need you to understand something, this isn't just a performance. The people we're going to fool are my family. And I need to know if they really are my family. Rebecca opened the folder slowly, her green eyes scanning the clauses of the contract. What if we find out they're not? Then at least I'll know the truth before it's too late. The sound of cups clinking and conversations in the background filled the silence between them. Rebecca finally picked up the pen, but before she signed, she looked at Mason again. "There's one condition that's not in the contract," she said. "Promise me that, whatever we find out, you won't let this harden your heart any further." Mason felt something strange in his chest, a mixture of surprise and something else, something he couldn't name. He nodded slightly, watching as Rebecca signed the contract that would start the biggest performance of their lives. What neither of them knew at that moment was that some performances have the power to reveal greater truths than those we intend to discover. No, not like that. Rebecca adjusted her posture, sitting on the leather sofa in Mason's office. Claire Matthews wouldn't be so formal. She's a tech entrepreneur, used to the relaxed atmosphere of Silicon Valley. I need to incorporate that naturalness. 2 weeks had passed since the contract was signed, and rehearsals for the big performance were in full swing. Mason watched, fascinated, as Rebecca transformed into Claire before his eyes. It was like watching an artist bring a blank canvas to life. "Tell me about Modified Solutions," Mason asked, testing her. It was the name of the fictitious company they had created for Claire. "We develop artificial intelligence systems for supply chain optimization," Rebecca replied without hesitation, leaning in enthusiastically. "Our last project reduced Kaiser Industries' logistics costs by 40%. In fact," she smiled, adjusting a loose lock of her hair, "it was during the presentation of this case at the Tech Summit that I bumped into you, literally spilling coffee on your Brioni shirt." Mason couldn't hold back a smile. "Impressive. Even I could almost believe I ruined a $3,000 shirt that day." "The secret is to mix truth with fiction," Rebecca explained, momentarily turning back into herself. "Claire has a lot of me in her, her passion for classic literature, her fear of heights, her peanut allergy. The more real she is to me, the more real she will be to others." Mason's phone vibrated. It was Amanda again. His expression hardened as he read the message. "Your sister?" Rebecca asked softly. "Yes. She's organizing a charity dinner to raise funds for the veterinary clinic. The kind of event she only does when she needs investors." Mason paused, his fingers drumming on the table. "I think we found our opportunity." The following evening, the Canlis restaurant, one of the most exclusive in Seattle, served as the stage for the first act of their elaborate play. Mason arrived alone, as usual, greeting his sister Amanda with a distant hug. "You finally came," Amanda exclaimed, her black designer dress shimmering under the ambient lights. "We need your support on this project so much, Mason. The clinic can make a difference to the lives of so many animals." Mason nodded mechanically, already familiar with the speech. That's when his phone rang, and an involuntary smile appeared on his lips as he saw the name on the screen. "Claire," he answered, his voice softening visibly. "No, it's not late." "Yes, I'm at an event." Actually, he looked at Amanda, who was watching curiously. "Why don't you come? I'm sure my sister would love to meet you." 30 minutes later, Rebecca, or rather Claire, walked into the restaurant as if she had just left an important meeting. Her teal dress was elegant without being ostentatious, her shoes were expensive but comfortable, just like a successful tech entrepreneur would wear. "Mason," she smiled, approaching the table. The way her eyes lit up at the sight of him didn't seem the least bit rehearsed. Amanda watched the scene with barely disguised interest, especially when Mason stood up to greet Claire with a soft kiss on the cheek. "Amanda, this is Claire Matthews." "Claire, my sister Amanda. Mason has told me so much about you." Claire shook Amanda's hand warmly. "He mentioned your project for the veterinary clinic. You know, my company has a social responsibility program that looks for initiatives like yours." Amanda's eyes sparkled, and Mason had to hold back a smile. Rebecca was playing it perfectly. Claire wasn't just a potential girlfriend, she was a possible investor. As the evening progressed, Mason noticed how his sister subtly changed her behavior. The looks of concern for her well-being, the questions about her personal life, the sudden interest in her stories from the past, all perfectly timed with Claire's presence. Between plates of smoked salmon and conversations about investments, Mason noticed something unexpected. The way Rebecca laughed at his jokes didn't seem rehearsed. The way her fingers occasionally brushed his on the table carried a disturbing naturalness. For a moment, he almost forgot that it was all an elaborate act. "You look different," Amanda commented when Claire left briefly. "You're lighter. I haven't seen you smile like that for ages." Mason felt a tightness in his chest. It was true, he was different. But was it because the plan was working, or was there something more? When Claire returned, she brought with her a story about her supposed childhood in Portland, and Mason found himself paying attention to details that weren't part of the script they had rehearsed. The way she gestured when talking about her first computer, the nostalgic gleam in her eyes when mentioning her father, they were touches too small to be planned. At the end of the evening, as they waited for the valet to bring their cars around, Amanda pulled Mason aside. "She's special," she whispered, with a sincerity he hadn't heard in years. "Don't ruin it this time, okay?" Mason nodded mechanically, but his mind was elsewhere. He watched Claire say goodbye to the other guests, her laughter echoing in the cold Seattle night. The plan was working perfectly, perhaps too well. Because for the first time since this whole farce began, Mason wondered who was really fooling whom. A sharp pain shot through Mason's temple during the council meeting. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking deep breaths as the executives discussed financial projections. The aneurysm was getting worse, but no one but Dr. Richards knew that. "Mr. Bennett?" Patricia's voice brought him back. "Claire Matthews is here for lunch." The other directors exchanged curious glances. Over the last 2 months, rumors about the Empire Capital CEO's relationship with the promising tech entrepreneur had spread like wildfire. Exactly as planned. Rebecca, no, Claire, he had to remember, was waiting in the office, wearing a dark green tailoring suit that perfectly matched her eyes. But there was something different about her expression today. Did something happen? Mason asked as soon as they were alone. "Your nephew Brandon came looking for me," she replied, taking a seat in the armchair by the window. "He found me in the cafe near Modified Solutions." Mason felt his stomach turn. Brandon was the sharpest of the family, always investigating everything and everyone. He wanted to know more about my company. He asked a lot of specific questions about our projects, our clients. Rebecca paused, a smile appearing at the corner of her lips. "Luckily, I've spent the last few weeks studying every detail of the technology sector. I even offered to introduce you to some contacts in software development companies." "You're amazing," Mason let slip, and for a moment they were both silent, surprised by the sincerity of the compliment. Rebecca was the first to break the moment. "There's one more thing. Amanda is organizing a weekend at the family cottage in Wenatchee. Apparently, it's tradition to get everyone together when someone in the family is in a serious relationship." "I've never heard of that tradition," Mason frowned. "Exactly," Rebecca laughed softly. "She's invented it now. It's our perfect chance to test everyone at once." Mason walked over to the window, watching the movement of the city below. An entire weekend keeping up the charade, with the whole family watching their every move. It was risky, but necessary. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" he asked, his voice softer than he had intended. Rebecca stood up, joining him at the window. "That's not what worries me," she said softly. "Mason, we need to talk about your medical tests." He froze. "How?" "You left an envelope from the hospital on your desk last week." "I didn't read it, but," she hesitated. "Why didn't you tell me?" "It's not part of the contract," he replied dryly, walking away. "To hell with the contract," her voice shook slightly. For a moment, Mason didn't know if he was listening to Rebecca or Claire. Don't you think that changes everything? If your family finds out, they won't find out, Mason cut in. Not yet. I need to know the truth first. Rebecca stared at him for a long moment before nodding slowly. Fine. But on one condition, after this weekend, no more secrets between us. Even if it's just professionally. The last word came out hesitantly, as if she too was no longer sure of the boundaries between reality and acting. The rest of the week passed in a blur of preparations. Rebecca plunged even deeper into the character of Claire, memorizing family stories that Mason had shared, studying old photos, learning every detail that could make her presence more convincing. On Friday, as they drove along the scenic route towards Wenatchee, Mason glanced over as she reviewed her notes. First girlfriend, Melissa Rogers, high school. Favorite childhood color, green. Allergy to strawberries. You don't have to be perfect, he said softly. Rebecca put down her notes, looking out the window at the mountains that were beginning to appear on the horizon. Isn't that why you're paying me? The question hung in the air like a smoke screen, painfully reminding them of the true nature of their relationship. Mason gripped the steering wheel tighter, ignoring another twinge of pain in his temple. They arrived at the country house in the late afternoon. It was an impressive wood and glass building overlooking the Columbia River. Amanda was already there with her husband Richard, as well as Brandon and his girlfriend Sophia. The rest of the family would arrive the next day. Claire, darling. Amanda hugged Rebecca as if they were longtime friends. Come on, let me show you to your room. Mason, Richard needs help with the grill. As he followed Richard out onto the back deck, Mason saw out of the corner of his eye Rebecca being taken on a tour of the house by Amanda and Sophia. She fitted in so naturally with the family atmosphere that for a moment he almost believed his own lie. So, Richard began, stirring the embers, has someone finally managed to tame Seattle's lone wolf? Mason forced a smile, but his thoughts were upstairs, where he could hear the women's laughter. In 2 months, Rebecca had achieved what he hadn't in years, making his family seem like a real family again. The question that plagued him, as the sun set over the mountains of Washington, was whether it was all just another illusion, and whether, when the curtain finally fell, there would be anything real to salvage. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen of the cottage when Rebecca came downstairs the next morning. Wearing yoga pants and an oversized sweater, she found Mason sitting alone at the kitchen table, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the French windows illuminating his thoughtful expression. Couldn't sleep? She asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. The sofa isn't as comfortable as it looks, he replied, referring to the arrangement they had made the night before. He had insisted on sleeping on the sofa in the bedroom, keeping up appearances for the family while respecting the professional boundaries between them. Mason, Rebecca began, but was interrupted by the sound of cars arriving. The next few minutes were a whirlwind of introductions. Aunt Margaret, an elegant lady with silver hair, who immediately began questioning Claire about her intentions with her nephew. Cousins Patrick and Lauren, with their respective spouses and children, all curious about the woman who had managed to capture the heart of Seattle's most coveted bachelor. So, Claire, Lauren asked during the brunch Amanda had organized on the deck, how do you manage to balance your business with a relationship? Mason always used work as an excuse to keep everyone at arm's length. Rebecca felt Mason tense beside her. Under the table, her hand instinctively found his. Actually, she replied with a soft smile, it was precisely our commitment to work that brought us together. Sometimes you need to find someone who understands your priorities in order to redefine them. Mason intertwined his fingers with hers, and Rebecca felt her heart race. It was just part of the act, she reminded herself. But why, then, did her pulse race every time he touched her? Morning turned into afternoon, and the family split up into groups. Some went to the lake, others played cards on the veranda. Mason and Rebecca ended up on a walk along the paths near the property, accompanied by Brandon and Sophia. You need to tell the story of how you met. Sophia insisted, her enthusiasm almost childish. Did Amanda mention anything about spilled coffee? Rebecca laughed, preparing to retell the rehearsed story, but Mason beat her to it. It was funny, actually, he began, a different glint in his eyes. She was so engrossed in explaining to a client how her technology could revolutionize his logistics that she didn't see me standing there. The coffee was hot, but he looked at Rebecca with an intensity that made her momentarily forget that this was a fabricated story. It was worth every penny of the ruined shirt. "You never told me your side of the story," she murmured, genuinely surprised by the details he had added to the narrative. "Some things don't need to be rehearsed," he replied quietly, just for her to hear. Brandon, who had been watching the interaction intently, snorted. "Claire, I hear you grew up in Portland. Do you know the restaurant Undina? It's my girlfriend's favorite when we visit the city." "Actually," Rebecca began, her stomach freezing. They had researched Portland extensively, but she had never heard of this particular restaurant. "No, love, you're confusing it," Mason interjected softly. "Claire told me that her favorite in Portland is Le Pigeon. Undina's great too, but," he smiled, as if sharing an intimate memory, "she has a particular thing for the way Le Pigeon prepares foie gras." Rebecca felt a wave of gratitude and something else, something she shouldn't have been feeling. The ease with which Mason protected her, how he paid attention to every little detail she mentioned in their conversations, even those that weren't part of the script. The walk continued, and Brandon eventually started talking about his plans for medical school. But Rebecca barely listened. Her mind was caught up in the warmth of Mason's hand in hers, in the way he occasionally squeezed her fingers as they passed steeper sections of the path. Back at the house, late in the afternoon, Aunt Margaret insisted on showing her old family albums. Rebecca found herself absorbed in photographs of a younger Mason, his smile more frequent, his eyes less guarded. "That was the summer he built a tree house for Brandon," Margaret explained, pointing to a particular photo. "He spent weeks working on it, even though he had dozens of important meetings." "He never told me that," Rebecca said softly, studying the picture of a sawdust-covered Mason, smiling proudly next to a child Brandon. "There's a lot about Mason that few people know," Margaret replied, her gaze penetrating. "He's built so many walls around himself over the last few years. It's nice to see someone finally breaking them down." Rebecca felt her chest tighten. If only Margaret knew that she was part of those walls, another layer of protection that Mason had hired. Later, when everyone had retired, Rebecca found Mason in the library, an untouched glass of whiskey in his hand. "They love you," he said without turning around. "Just as I knew they would." "Mason, the funny thing is," he continued, finally turning to face her, "I'm beginning to understand why." The silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca took a step towards him, then stopped, aware of the invisible line she couldn't cross. "You need to rest," she said at last. "Tomorrow will be another long day." As she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, Rebecca realized that she was shaking. Because for the first time since they started this farce, she was no longer sure if she could keep her heart off the script. Returning to Seattle brought with it a new reality that neither of them had anticipated. Sitting in her Capitol Hill apartment, Rebecca stared at the original script they had created, now covered in annotations and alterations. The words seemed blurred, irrelevant. How could she follow a script and every beat of her heart was improvising new dialogue? Her phone vibrated, a message from Amanda inviting her to an all-girls lunch. Not Claire Matthews, the tech entrepreneur, but Rebecca Anderson, the actress who was now playing two roles, one professional and one she didn't dare name. The intercom rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Mason. "We need to talk," he said as soon as she opened the door. He was paler than usual, the dark circles under his eyes pronounced. "You've been to the doctor," she realized immediately. "What did he say?" Mason walked over to the window overlooking the Space Needle, his hands restlessly in his coat pockets. "The treatment isn't working as expected? Dr. Richards wants to try a more aggressive approach." Rebecca felt her heart squeeze. "How long?" "Less than we first thought." He turned to face her. I need to speed up our plan. Mason, no. You need to tell them. Your family has the right to, my family, he laughed humorlessly. You've seen how they've changed since you showed up. Suddenly, everyone has time for family dinners. Brandon hasn't asked me for money once this month. Even Margaret is planning to move back to Seattle to be closer. Doesn't that prove that they care? It proves that they care about the idea of me that you've created. Her voice rose slightly, then softened. You're so good at what you do, Rebecca, that even I sometimes forget that this is just an act. The words hit her like a slap. Rebecca took a step back, crossing her arms as if to protect her heart. Is it? So tell me, Mason, why have you memorized every detail of the stories I've made up? Why do you complete my sentences before I even say them? Why does your heart race every time I hold your hand? Mason remained motionless. Like you, because mine does too, she confessed, her voice almost a whisper. And that wasn't in a script. The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, rain began to fall gently on Seattle, blurring the city lights. This is dangerous, Mason finally said, his voice hoarse. We can't, his phone rang, cutting the moment short. It was Patricia. Mr. Bennett, Brandon's here at the office. He says it's urgent. Mason exchanged a worried glance with Rebecca before answering, I'm on my way. 20 minutes later, they entered Empire Capital Group together. Brandon was waiting for them in Mason's office, his expression unreadable. What happened? Mason asked, closing the door behind them. Brandon stood up slowly, placing a file on the table. I found something interesting about modified solutions. He opened the file, revealing pages of research. It's funny how such an innovative company has no public record. No verifiable clients. No real office. Rebecca felt the blood freeze in her veins. Mason stepped forward, putting himself partially between her and Brandon. What do you want, Brandon? The truth would be a good start, he replied, his eyes fixed on Rebecca. Who are you really? Brandon, I can explain. No, Mason interrupted, his voice firm. I'll explain. He walked over to his desk, opening a drawer and taking out an envelope. But first, I need you to read this. Rebecca recognized the hospital envelope. Mason, don't, it's time, he said softly, handing the envelope to Brandon. Read it. The next few minutes were excruciating. Rebecca watched Brandon's face change as he read the medical diagnosis, the color leaving his features. How long? Brandon asked, his voice trembling. A few months, maybe less. Why didn't you tell us? Mason smiled sadly. Because I needed to know if you cared about me or my money. So I hired the best actress I could find to create a story that would test all of you. Brandon looked at Rebecca, understanding dawning in his eyes. Claire Matthews doesn't exist. No, she confirmed softly. My name is Rebecca Anderson. I'm an actress. But the feelings, Brandon began, looking between the two of them. The way you look at each other, the way you act together, it can't just be acting. Rebecca felt the tears she had been holding back start to fall. Mason took a step towards her, then stopped, as if remembering that he no longer had the right. Brandon, Mason said, his voice tired. I need you to keep this a secret for now. I'll tell everyone, but I have to do it my way. Brandon nodded slowly, still processing everything. Before leaving, he stopped at the door and turned around. You know what the irony is? Your plan worked even too well. For the first time in years, we're really a family again. He looked at Rebecca. Thanks to you. Even if it started out as a lie. After Brandon left, Mason and Rebecca were silent, the weight of everything that had been revealed, and everything that still needed to be said, hanging between them. What do we do now? She finally asked. Mason looked out of the window, the the night city of Seattle glistening in the rain. Now, he replied softly, we need to decide what's real and what's just part of the show. The problem, Rebecca thought as she watched his profile against the city lights, was that her heart had made up its mind a long time ago. And no script in the world could have predicted that. The results of the new tests arrived on a rainy Tuesday. Mason was staring at them in his office when Rebecca walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She had developed this habit over the last few weeks, turning up unannounced, just to check on him. It wasn't part of the contract, but it wasn't just acting either. That bad? She asked, placing a cup on his desk. The tumor has grown, he replied simply. Dr. Richards wants to start radiotherapy immediately. Rebecca sat down in the chair opposite him, her fingers drumming nervously on the cup. Since Brandon's discovery 3 weeks ago, something had changed between them. The boundaries between Claire Matthews and Rebecca Anderson had become even more blurred, as had the lines between professional and personal. Brandon's right, you know, she said softly. Your family is different. Yesterday Amanda called me, not to talk about investments or the clinic, but to ask about you. She's noticed that you've been getting more tired. Mason closed his eyes for a moment. They're approaching the wrong person. I'm not the man you made them believe I was. No. Rebecca leaned forward. The man who spends hours reviewing the company's charity projects to make sure the money is actually helping people. The same one who secretly pays for free employees' college. Who keeps all the thank you letters he receives in a locked drawer. Mason stared at her, surprised. Like you, Patricia, she smiled. She can be very revealing when she's worried about you. And she is, Mason. Everyone is. The phone rang, interrupting the moment. It was Brandon? Uncle, his voice sounded tense. Amanda is organizing a surprise dinner for you tonight. She wants to announce that she's pregnant. She wanted you to be the first to know, after Richard. Mason felt the weight of irony. His sister finally trusting him with something so personal, just when his own lie was about to fall apart. I'll be there, he replied, then hung up. Rebecca watched his expression change. What? Amanda's pregnant, he said, getting up to look out of the window. My sister's going to have a child who will probably never meet me. Rebecca stood up too, moving closer to him. Then don't allow it. Tell them the truth. All the truths. What truths? He turned to face her. That I'm dying. That I hired an actress to manipulate them. Or that I made the mistake of falling in love with her in the process. The silence that followed his confession was absolute. Rebecca felt her heart stop, then speed up uncontrollably. Mason, no, he held up a hand, stopping her from approaching. We can't. This isn't fair to you. Fair? She laughed humorlessly. You know what's not fair? Having to pretend I don't feel anything when you walk into a room. Having to calculate every touch, every look, because I don't know what's real and what's acting anymore. Having to, her words were interrupted when Mason crossed the distance between them and kissed her. It wasn't like the rehearsed kisses they exchanged in public, calculated and contained. This one was real, desperate, charged with all the feelings they had repressed for months. When they finally broke apart, they were both panting. Mason leaned his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. I'm sorry, he murmured. For what? For making everything so complicated. Rebecca touched his face gently. Life is complicated, Mason. That's why we need to be honest about the things that really matter. The intercom rang, Patricia announcing the next meeting. Reality intruded once again. Dinner, Mason said, reluctantly walking away. Amanda's expecting us at 7. I'm going to need a new dress. Rebecca tried to smile, but her hands were still shaking. Claire Matthews never repeats an outfit on special occasions. Rebecca, Mason grabbed her hand before she could leave. What if it wasn't Claire tonight? What if it was just you? She felt her heart skip a beat. Are you sure? No, he admitted. But I'm tired of wasting what time I have left living a lie. Rebecca nodded slowly. Okay. But on one condition: after dinner, we talk. About everything. Everything. Everything, she confirmed, squeezing his hand one last time before leaving. Mason returned to his desk, absent-mindedly touching his lips where he could still taste the kiss. In a few hours, he would face his family with the truth, or at least part of it. But the scariest truth was the one he had just admitted to himself. In the midst of all the lies he had orchestrated, he had stumbled upon something genuine. And now, with time running out, he needed to figure out how to turn this unexpected truth into something he could leave as a legacy for his family, and for the woman who had taught his heart to beat again, even if it was too late. The Metropolitan Grill restaurant was closed for a private event that evening. Amanda had booked the entire hall, and as Mason watched his family arrive, Aunt Margaret, the cousins, Brandon and Sophia, he felt the weight of every lie he had told over the last few months. Rebecca was late. On purpose, he knew. She had texted him earlier, "I need to get ready to be myself." It was funny how, after months of pretending to be someone else, the truth seemed the hardest part to play. Mason. Amanda hugged him warmly, her face radiant. He hugged her back, thinking of the nephew or niece he might never meet. "Where's Claire?" Mason began, but was interrupted by the murmur that ran through the hall. Rebecca had arrived. But this wasn't the Claire Matthews everyone knew, with her impeccable suits and calculated executive posture. This was Rebecca Anderson, wearing a simple blue silk dress, her naturally wavy hair falling over her shoulders, without the expensive accessories that were part of her character. The family's confused looks were evident. Only Brandon maintained a neutral expression, although his eyes showed concern. "Sorry I'm late," she said, her voice different, softer, more natural. Mason felt his heart squeeze as he realized that he was, for the first time, seeing the real Rebecca in front of everyone. "Claire, you look different," Amanda commented, frowning slightly. About that, Mason stood up, but a sudden dizziness made him stagger. Rebecca was at his side instantly, holding his arm. It wasn't acting, it was pure instinct. "Mason." The concern in his sister's voice was genuine. "What's going on?" He looked at Rebecca, who nodded slightly. It was time. "I need to tell you something," he began, his voice weaker than he would have liked. "Actually, several things." First, he continued, taking the hospital envelope from his inside jacket pocket, "this." Margaret was the first to react after reading the diagnosis, a sob escaping her lips. "How long?" "A few months." "The treatment isn't months." Amanda interrupted, her hands shaking as she gripped the paper. "Why didn't you tell us before?" "Because I needed to know," Mason replied, sitting down again. The room seemed to spin. "I needed to know if you cared about me or my money." A heavy silence fell over the room. Rebecca stepped forward, her hands intertwined nervously. "My name is Rebecca Anderson," she said softly. "I'm an actress. Mason hired me to play Claire Matthews as part of an experiment." The shock on Amanda's face was devastating. "An experiment?" "I was wrong," Mason quickly interjected. "About everything. About you. About my own motivations. And above all," he looked at Rebecca, "about what was real and what was acting." "So it was all a lie?" Margaret's voice trembled. "Every moment, every conversation, no," Rebecca replied, tears in her eyes. "In the beginning, yes. But something changed. I changed. We've all changed." "It's true," Brandon spoke up, surprising everyone. "Look at us. When was the last time we got together like this? That we really talked? That we acted like a family?" Amanda stood up abruptly, a protective hand on her still flat stomach. I was going to tell you. I was going to share the most important news of my life with you, Mason. How could you? Amanda, Rebecca took a step towards her, but stopped when Amanda stepped back. Your pregnancy was the last straw. It's what made Mason realize he couldn't go on with this. He wants to be present in his son's life, to be the uncle he's always been to Brandon. The uncle he's always been. Amanda laughed bitterly. The uncle who hires people to fake feelings. Who manipulates everyone around him. No, Mason tried to get up again, but the dizziness got worse. The uncle who built a tree house while you spent sleepless nights. Who kept every drawing you made as a child, Amanda. Who, his words were interrupted as he staggered, his vision darkening at the edges. Rebecca caught him before he fell, and suddenly everyone was around him. Call an ambulance, someone shouted. Through the haze that was beginning to take over his consciousness, Mason saw something extraordinary, his family, united for the first time in years, not by money or obligation, but by genuine concern. Amanda held his hand, tears streaming down her face. Margaret was already on the phone to Dr. Richards. And Rebecca? Rebecca was hugging him, whispering in his ear, "Don't you dare leave me now. Not when we're finally being honest." The last thing Mason thought before losing consciousness was that sometimes it takes an elaborate lie to reveal the deepest truths. And that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to turn those truths into something real. "I'm sorry," he muttered, before everything went dark, for everything. The sound of sirens began to echo in the distance, mingling with the restrained sobs of his family in Rebecca's voice, firm in the midst of the chaos. "Stay with me, Mason. Just stay with me." The hospital room overlooked the Puget Sound, but Rebecca barely noticed the sunset painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Her eyes were fixed on the heart monitor next to Mason's bed, each regular beat a small miracle after the last 72 hours of uncertainty. "You should go home and rest," Amanda said softly, entering the room with 2 cups of coffee. "I can stay with him tonight." Rebecca accepted the coffee, but made no mention of moving from the chair she'd been sitting in since Mason had come out of emergency surgery. "I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see him passing out in that restaurant." Amanda sat in the other chair, one hand unconsciously resting on her stomach. The silence between them was no longer as tense as it had been the first few days after the revelation. It had turned into something different, but kind of mutual understanding born of shared concern. "You know," Amanda began, her voice thoughtful, "I've spent the last few days trying to separate what was true from what was a lie. And I realized something interesting." She looked at Rebecca. "All those times you talked about how Mason cared about me, about the little things he did, none of it was a lie, was it?" Rebecca shook her head, tears threatening to fall. "No. I just showed everyone the Mason he wouldn't let anyone else see." "Why did you stay?" Amanda asked softly. "After the feelings became real. It must have been painful to keep pretending." "Because," Rebecca hesitated, looking down at the sleeping Mason. "Because sometimes love isn't a choice. It's like waking up one day and realizing that your heart has already decided for you." A subtle movement in the bed interrupted the conversation. Mason was waking up. "I'll call the nurse," Amanda said, getting up quickly. But before she left, she stopped and surprised Rebecca with a quick hug. "Thank you. For loving him even when he was trying not to be loved." Mason opened his eyes slowly, blinking against the soft light in the room. His gaze met Rebecca's immediately. "You're still here," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "Always," she replied, taking his hand. "Mr. Bennett," Dr. Richards entered the room, followed by Amanda and Brandon. "The surgery was a success. We were able to remove a large part of the tumor, and with the new treatment protocol we discussed, how long?" Mason interrupted, his hand squeezing Rebecca's. The doctor smiled. "If everything goes as we hope, much longer than a few months. Years, Probably. Especially if you follow the treatment to the letter and, he looked meaningfully at the family gathered in the room, maintain a good support system. The next few weeks passed in a blur of treatment sessions, family visits, and small daily victories. Rebecca remained by Mason's side, no longer as Claire Matthews or as a hired actress, but as herself, with all the complexities and uncertainties that brought. One particularly sunny afternoon, while Mason was strong enough for a short walk around the hospital grounds, he suddenly stopped. "Marry me," he said, turning to Rebecca. She laughed nervously. "Mason, you're on strong medication." "No," he held up his hands. "I'm more lucid than I've ever been. I've spent my life building walls and hiring people to keep everyone at a safe distance. And then you came along, supposed to be another one of those barriers, but you turned out to be the person who finally broke them down." "Mason, let me finish," he continued, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "I love you. Not the Claire Matthews we created, but you, Rebecca Anderson. The woman who can quote Shakespeare from memory, who drinks coffee with too much sugar, who cries watching dog commercials. The woman who stayed by my side not because she was being paid, but because she chose to." Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face. "You forgot to mention that I also snore when I sleep." Mason laughed, pulling her closer. "That too. Will you marry me?" "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "But on one condition." "What?" "No performances at our wedding. Only truths from now on." 6 months later, in the garden of their country home in Wenatchee, Mason and Rebecca exchanged vows in front of a family that had learned that sometimes you have to lose something to really find it. Amanda, now visibly pregnant, cried throughout the ceremony. Brandon served as best man, his speech making everyone laugh as he mentioned how his detailed investigation had inadvertently helped create true love. During the reception, Aunt Margaret approached the couple, her eyes shining with wisdom. "You know," she said, holding up a glass of champagne, "they say that the best love stories begin with a lie and end with a truth. But I think that, in your case, the truth was there all along. It just needed an elaborate script to reveal itself." Mason looked at Rebecca, who was dancing with her 5-year-old nephew, Lauren's son. His heart, now healthy and strong thanks to the successful treatment, was filled with gratitude. "You know what's ironic, Aunt Margaret?" he smiled. "I spent a fortune hiring an actress to find out if my family really loved me. And in the process, I not only found out that they did, I found a love that no amount of money could buy." Margaret squeezed his hand affectionately. "Sometimes, darling, life's greatest treasures are found when you stop looking for them." Rebecca returned to them, her face flushed from dancing. Mason pulled her close, kissing her forehead. "So, Mrs. Bennet," he whispered, "ready for our next big adventure?" Rebecca smiled, that same smile that had captivated him months ago, when she was still Claire Matthews. But now it was different, it was real, true, and completely hers. "With you," she replied, entwining her fingers with his. "Always." And so, under the starry Washington sky, surrounded by the family they had rediscovered and the love they had found in the most unexpected way, Mason and Rebecca Bennet began their own chapter, one that needed no script, because the best part of their lives now was simply being who they really were.